Hi, it's Steve. Today we're going to show you how to change the motor on your dryer, and it's a really easy job. All we're going to need is a Phillips screwdriver, a large flat blade screwdriver, a 1/4-inch nut driver or a 1/4-inch socket with a short extension and a ratchet, a 3/8 socket, maybe a pair of needle nose pliers, and a 5/32 Allen key. Let me show you how we do it. Now before we begin this repair, the first thing we should do is to disconnect power to the dryer. So it has a cord on it, simply unplug it, and if it's a hardwired dryer, you need to locate the fuse or breaker panel and turn the power off there. Now next we're going to open up the dryer door, and we'll locate 2 Phillips screws that come up through the top of the front panel and into the main top. So we're going to remove both of those. Then next we'll just take each side of that top panel from the corners, lift up on it, and then as we lift up, we're going to pull slightly forward and roll it away from these 3 tabs on the bottom of the console. And they fit into 3 slots at the back of the top panel. Now next we're going to remove 2 Phillips screws that are just inside the top, and they secure the front panel to the cabinet. And we'll just lift that front panel off the 2 tabs in the bottom, and then we're going to pivot it around out of the way, and you can just lean it up against the cabinet. And if you don't have room to do that, you will need to disconnect the wires to the door switch so that you can set it aside. Now next we'll need to disengage the drum belt from the idler so that we can pull the drum out. I'll have to reach one hand in through this side. The idler is located over on the left side here, and another one across the top, and just pull the idler towards the center of the cabinet and release the tension on the belt. Once we've got that belt loosened up, I suggest that you remove 1 screw on the right hand side here that secures the cabinet to this cross brace, and that will give us a little more room to open the cabinet up to pull the drum out through the front. We're just going to set that drum aside. Next we need to remove that whole motor assembly from the dryer. We'll start by removing the 2 dark colored Phillips screws from that cross piece on the front that secures the front portion of that blower housing. We'll also need to remove a single screw for the cycling thermostat, and then there is 1 more screw in behind here that secures the base of that motor mount to the base of the cabinet, and then we can just pull that straight back. And once we've got it out of that blower housing area, we can rotate that around, and we'll need to remove the wires from the motor switch. So take note of the location of all of those wires, and then we'll remove them. Just pull each of those wires off of the motor. We'll also want to remove wires from the belt switch, and then the single screw that holds that ground wire to the motor base. Now if you have a short enough nut driver, you can get at that screw, otherwise you'll have to use your ratchet and a socket. Now there's also 1 wire that runs from the motor switch back up to the heater terminal, and it fits through that opening in the back of the motor mount. So it's a little easier to just pull that off of the heater and then pull it out through that opening. At this point we can take that whole motor blower assembly and we'll set that on a suitable work surface where we can change out the motor. Now our next step will be to remove the blower wheel or fan from the front of the motor shaft as well as this housing. So using a 3/8 socket with a short extension, we're going to remove that retaining screw and the retaining bracket and set those aside, and just tuck the back portion of that retaining bracket in through that opening while we slide the blower wheel off the motor shaft, and then we can set that aside, and you can slide that portion of the bracket off. And you'll note there are 2 Phillips screws that are hidden in here. We need to remove both of those. We'll stand that up again. Now on the back there is a single 1/4-inch hex head screw that secures the motor frame to the base of the blower assembly, and often there is a flat metal nut on the inside here that you'll need to hold in place as you remove that screw. So either just using your fingers or a pair of pliers, keep that piece from turning as you remove the screw. Now we can stand that up again, and if we lift the motor base up from the bottom, we can pull the whole assembly out through. We'll set that portion of the blower housing aside, and then we can next remove the motor mounts. Now next we're going to remove this rear motor mount. It's a spring type of mount, so just take a large flat blade screwdriver, go into that area, push down on it and pry out until it releases, and then set it aside. You can then lift the motor off of that mounting bracket, and we'll get ready to install our new motor. Now our next step will be to determine the length of the motor, including the pulley, because the kit comes with two separate pulleys. So we're going to match it up with the original motor so that we get the exact same length. We'll choose that pulley, just start to set screw in it, and press it onto the motor shaft until it bottoms out. And if it fits on there kind of tight, clean the inside of that pulley out rather than tap it with a mallet. We just want to make sure that it will slide on there. Then using a 5/32 Allen key, we will tighten that set screw, make sure it's secure. Now if your kit came supplied with two screws to mount the new motor mount to your new motor, we can proceed and discard the old motor. But if it did not come with those screws, we'll need to remove them from the old mounts and reuse the screws. We can then discard the old motor. Now the new mounts will have a raised tab that we're going to point away from the motor. We're going to sit one of those brackets on the top of the motor and one on the bottom. And there's also a couple of locator tabs on those brackets that we'll need to pull up right tight against the edge of that metal band. So just hold them in place until we start those two screws. And we'll go through the larger hole on the end tab into a smaller hole on the bottom mount. So they'll end up being offset from each other. Now just make sure that we pull that up tight against that metal band. We have it aligned with the tabs straight up and down with the square front of the motor, and then tighten those screws securely. Now we can proceed to put the rear mount in place. So we're going to lay that motor on top of that motor mount bracket, and we're going to face the motor switch upright. We'll take our retaining clamp, we'll hook it over the bottom side, rotate it around, making sure that it lines up with that metal band on the motor mount, and then using a flat blade screwdriver, we're going to put some tension on that spring and make sure it hooks securely. And now we can set the motor into the blower housing bracket. We're going to keep this portion of the motor mount in front of this tab. So we'll insert the motor shaft through the front first, then the two vertical tabs coming up from that blower mount base will fit through two slots in the motor mount. We'll then install the single 1/4" hex head screw to secure the back using the metal tab. Just reach inside and hold that tab in place while we tighten the screw. Now next we're going to install the two screws through the front of the blower housing base. Now keeping in mind that the front motor mounting bracket is new, the screw holes will be a little bit smaller than the original one, so you may need to run a tap through them first just to make it a little easier to get them started, and then we'll tighten those securely, making sure that the motor shaft is centered in the front of that housing. Tighten them securely. We're now ready to put the blower fan on, so we'll begin by putting the rear bracket on first, and it has a D-shaped hole in it that will match the motor shaft. So push that on all the way until it bottoms out. We'll line up the blower wheel. Just make sure that mounting bracket comes out through the hole. And that will allow the blower wheel to get fully inserted onto the shaft. Then we'll put the outer mounting bracket on next. and the two ends of that will touch. We'll then install that 3/8 screw and then tighten it securely. And just make sure we have lots of clearance around that housing and it's not touching on anything. We're now ready to reinstall the motor and motor mounting bracket into the dryer. Now that we have the motor out, it's a good time to vacuum out the rest of the dryer and remove any lint buildup that may have accumulated. And then when reinstalling, we'll start by setting the motor in on its side like that first until we attach the wire harnesses. So we'll begin with the wire that went back through the opening at the rear motor mount bracket and up to the heater. So we'll reattach that one. And we need to make sure that that makes a solid connection at the heater. You can then locate the ground wire that attaches to the rear of that bracket. We'll put that on next. That uses the small 1/4" hex head screw, and it's a machine type screw rather than a self-tapping. Make sure that we tighten that securely. Next, we'll reattach the wires to the belt switch and separate the wires for the thermostat. And we're going to tuck those down through below the motor, and we'll leave them there until we're ready to stand the motor up. And now we can continue to reconnect the wires to the terminal block on the motor. Attach the ground wire on the far right. Now that we have all the wires reattached to the motor switch, we can set that upright. Now when we pull that forward, we're going to line up these two little slots at the front with the two openings in the base of the machine. You'll see the tabs on that lower mounting bracket that will fit into those. I'm just going to carefully slide that forward, fitting the fan blade into the blower housing opening, so that we have those lined up. I'm just going to pull that forward until it's fully inserted. Now at this point, we can install the rear mounting screw. We'll next install the two long screws through the front with that support into the rear of the blower housing. Again, tighten that securely. We can then pull the wires for the door switch through this opening in the front. And we can pull them down under that little retaining tab. Make sure there's no strain on them. Next, we'll pull the thermostat up into position. Up, install that single screw to secure it. Now before we go any farther, we want to make sure that all of our wires are free and clear and not pinched anywhere. Now to install the idler bracket and wheel, we'll need to hook the short arm on that bracket up through the opening on the back side of that blower housing, and then it will tuck down right into the channel along the base frame, and then it's secure. Now with the drum out, we'll show you how the belt will fit around the motor pulley and the idler pulley. We'll wrap around the motor pulley with the groove side towards the pulley, and then it's going to bring the flat side of that belt that is off to the right across the top of the idler, and the other one will come up around the drum like that. That puts tension on the belt. But you'll have to do this with the drum in place, so it's a good idea to see how it actually fits on there first. Now before we reinstall the drum into the dryer, we need to locate the rear bearing. You may find this a little easier to install it with the bearing sleeve over top of the shaft on the dryer drum. And we'll take our belt, we'll just drape that around the drum. We can use that to help support the weight of the drum as we're sliding it into the cabinet. We'll just slide it straight back, line it up with that rear bearing housing, and then we'll need to wrap that belt around the idler and motor pulleys. But next, we're just going to reach in on both the left and right hand sides. We'll find that belt, make sure that the groove side of the belt is facing towards the drum. And we're going to pull it below the motor pulley. Make sure we have it fitted into the grooves of the motor pulley. We'll pull the idler pulley towards the center of the drum, and then roll the belt over the top of the pulley. Now we're just going to carefully rotate that drum to make sure that the belt tracks properly in both pulleys. And just view it across the top and make sure that it's staying in that rear groove and that the groove side of the belt is staying against the drum. Just double check, make sure it's still in the motor pulley properly. Next, we can reinstall that screw on the right hand side to that support bracket. Next, we'll reconnect the wires to the door switch. So just rotate that panel around into position. Now to reinstall those wires, we're just going to pull that guard back out of the way. Make sure the locking tabs on that single connector are fully engaged. Reattach the other two wires to the door switch. Slide that guard in front of it, make sure the tab fits into the slot on the edge of the front panel. And we can rotate that panel around into position. We'll next line up the rectangular holes on the bottom. Make sure they're fully inserted. Then we'll tilt that front panel back while lifting up on the drum so that we clear the top bearing. Line up the locating tabs on the side, and then we can reinstall the two retaining screws at the top. And use caution when putting these top screws in that we don't drop them down inside the cabinet, or you'll have to take the front back off. And again, tighten them securely. And next we can put the main top on. Well, making sure that we engage those three tabs on the console into the top. And we'll pull that top far enough forward that we can hook the bottom lip of it underneath that rear bracket. Make sure it's engaged all the way across and is down tight at the back. We'll reinstall the two screws up through the front panel into the main top. We're now ready to reconnect the power, and our repair is complete.